Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Coach Pav and today I'm going to be joined by my good friend Andy Blow from Precision Hydration to talk about exactly how you can personalise your own hydration strategy. Andy, great to be with you. Thanks again for joining me. Let's start with maybe you just giving us a little bit about yourself, your background and who Precision Hydration actually are.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Pav. Always good to chat. Well, you know my backstory pretty well, but basically, for those that don't, hydration was the Achilles heel for me as an athlete when I was doing triathlon, particularly, but any sort of ultra long distance events. I would find that my own performances in the heat were a fraction of what they were in colder conditions. I was basically that guy that loved to be racing in the sleet and the rain and the hail and that sort of thing. But when it was hot and humid, my races would just fall apart completely. And I always knew I sweated a lot. That was pretty obvious to myself and those around me. But it was about in the early 2000s, a doctor friend of mine looked at the symptoms that I was getting in races, getting really bad cramps, falling apart in the heat, and ending up in the medical tent. And he said, "I think you're suffering with a lot of electrolyte loss." And he got me to go to a hospital, have a sweat test, and understand my individual electrolyte losses. And that was the point at which the light bulb went on, because I not only sweat a lot, I lose loads of sodium in my sweat. This was identified by the test. We modified what I was drinking during races and how many electrolytes I was taking in, and it was like night and day. It was the change that made a big difference to me. And like yourself, as well as being an athlete, I was coaching and working as a sports scientist with athletes. So the sweat testing and hydration testing became part of what I did with athletes. And over time that grew arms and legs. And, here we are like 15 years later, and Precision Hydration has been around for a long time, helping athletes to figure out how to hydrate for the crazy stuff that we love to do on a weekend.
Absolutely. Crazy stuff on the weekend is right. Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that, electrolytes. For those people that are watching that probably have a very basic understanding of, what our sweat even is, to be honest. And there's a lot of, myths. I like to say it's our mate Dave. Everybody's got a mate Dave. Yeah. Sorry to all the Daves out there. But everybody has got that friend who thinks that they know everything, and they've probably heard something from them. So let's just bust maybe a few myths or give the lowdown on exactly what our sweat is and why hydration is so important.
Yeah, well, sweat is the body's primary mechanism of cooling you down, because we all know that feeling. If we're lucky enough to go somewhere warm on holiday, jump in a swimming pool, jump out again, you can be boiling hot, you get out in the breeze and you're all of a sudden really cold. And the reason you go cold all of a sudden is because that's the evaporation of water off your skin, taking loads of heat away with it. It's a far more effective way of cooling down than any other way we have for cooling down. And when we're exercising, when we're running or riding a bike, we generate a lot of internal heat, and that's what needs to be offloaded to the environment. And so we start to sweat as our core body temperature rises, and that's how we dissipate heat to the environment. And sweat comes from the blood plasma. That's a fact that a lot of people don't know. It's like it's the watery part of your blood that you're losing out through your sweat glands onto the skin. And that's one of the reasons why sweat contains a lot of electrolytes, because your blood is naturally very salty. It's naturally very high in electrolytes, particularly one called sodium. And when you sweat, you lose some of that blood plasma onto the skin. And although your sweat glands do a good job of reabsorbing some of those electrolytes, you actually lose a proportion of them, which is why if you are like me, a salty sweater, or if you're just anyone who sweats for long enough, you can sometimes see a residue of a bit of salt on your kit. The classic one for cyclists is on the old helmet straps. Just there, you can see white tide marks. So you lose this electrolyte. And although, like with anything, your body can cope with a level of electrolyte disturbance, as in you can lose an amount of fluid and electrolytes before you start to see problems. At some point, if you don't replace enough fluid and sodium when you're sweating a lot, then you start to see your performance suffer quite negatively. And so a lot of people appreciate the need to replace the fluids, but it's always that there's then that question about, do I or don't I need to take electrolytes in, or when do I need to take them in? That's the trickier one to answer.
Absolutely. And is it just sodium that is the main one that we need to replace?
It's an oversimplification to sort of just focus on sodium, but we do that for a reason, because it's the predominant one that you lose. So in your sweat, if you measure your sweat, there'll be a little bit of calcium, magnesium, potassium, other electrolytes, other metabolites, but sodium is the big one, because that's the main electrolytes in your extracellular fluid. So it's the main one that's in your blood plasma. The main one inside your body's cells and your intracellular fluid is potassium. So that's an important electrolyte, but it's not one that we lose tons of when we sweat. So all electrolytes are important, and they're all really important in your diet. And if you eat lots of fresh food and fresh fruit and vegetables and that sort of stuff, you get a good amount of all the electrolytes. But sodium is the one that, as athletes specifically, we can lose the most of in a very short space of time if we're training hard, because that's the one we lose in sweat. So if you're ever looking at the back of a sports drink, it's why a good sports drink will often be predominant in sodium as the main electrolyte.
Fantastic. It's I go back, I always remember meeting Johnny, and it was someone else when we did our sweat testing when I was back at the Rye Wheelers many years ago. It goes back so far, because I mean, I always think it's like 5 years, but it's not, because I've lived in the States for 5 years now. So it's got to be more like 6, 7, or possibly even 8 years.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to understand the difference, the huge difference, potential difference between people and their sweat. And not just the volume of the fluid, but the quantity of sodium as well. And definitely, I'm a heavy sweater like yourself. I don't think I quite edge you, but I'm close on that scale. And one thing that resonates for me is definitely the deposits on my clothing. Especially when you wear black clothing, you get back and it's almost a totally different color. It's just a light layer of white, almost like I've been lying in really white sand to be like that. So it's crazy. I guess before we move on to first, obviously, personalisation of hydration and the performance benefits of getting it right. Let's talk a little bit about the problems associated, or the symptoms perhaps, of being dehydrated, aside from the fact that obviously there's some pretty good scientific evidence that gives some rather large numbers. I believe when I was researching this again, it's 30% I think, isn't it? You might be able to correct me on that, but even a small amount of fluid loss up to the certain point can be very detrimental to performance. But let's talk about for the people that maybe are embarking on a journey on this, maybe there's some day-to-day symptoms, general symptoms that they might be able to recognize.
Yeah, if you're dehydration, the biggest problem with dehydration acutely when you're exercising, so is the reduction in your blood volume, because, as I mentioned before, sweat comes from your blood plasma, so it gets drawn out of that, which immediately causes the amount of blood that's circulating in your body to drop. And when you're exercising, your heart rate goes up, because actually you need to pump more blood around the body in order to pump blood to the muscles that are working for metabolic reasons and for fueling reasons. And also you need to pump blood to the skin to help dissipate heat, because obviously the vascular system near the surface of the skin acts a bit like a radiator. So that's partly what brings heat from the core of the body to the surface. If you imagine, in very simple terms, like that's like the radiator in your car, and the water in the radiator is your blood. If you reduce the amount of fluid in that system, it's not going to work as well. So that's why when you see people's performance start to suffer in the heat, when they get dehydrated, it's primarily for those reasons. You've got less blood circulating, but of course it goes beyond that as well, because chronically being dehydrated has an effect on all of the body's tissues at a cellular level. So there's kind of that acute thing around being dehydrated and seeing your performance drop off, and there's the chronic dehydration thing of not staying topped up in and around daily life as much as your training sessions and races. Both of them kind of create issues, but probably both need tackling in slightly different ways, because day to day it's about good hydration habits. It's about drinking the right sort of things, not having too many caffeinated and alcoholic drinks, having plenty of waters and juices and all the kind of good stuff that most of us know, but maybe aren't always brilliant at doing. And then during exercise, it's understanding, okay, at what point do I really need to sort of take a more of an active role with my hydration and start focusing on what type of drinks to take in and that sort of thing. And I think I would say, if people, signs that you're sort of becoming dehydrated during exercise, the clearest one of all is thirst. You know, thirst is a really powerful drive. And if your blood volume's dropping and your blood's becoming more salty, then you're getting thirsty. You're getting dehydrated. Other ones can be after exercise. If you're if you're getting lightheaded, you know, when you have that thing where you sit down in a chair and you stand up quick and you feel like you've got no blood rushing to your head and you feel all woozy, that can be a sign that you're getting dehydrated. If your pee is becoming really dark, you know, although that can be tricked with certain things, it's not always the best indicator. If you put all of those things together, it starts to paint a picture that you're becoming dehydrated, and it's something you've got to sort of address. And I think, you know, it's always a balancing act with hydration, because on the whole, humans are pretty good at avoiding dehydration if we listen to our bodies. But there's a difference between being good at listening to your body just day to day when you're just operating in normal life, versus listening to your body when you're pushing yourself really hard and doing long sessions as an athlete. And that's like any athletic skill, learning to read the signs of dehydration early is really important. It's like learning how to do good pace judgment for hours and hours of riding, because the first time you go out and do a really long ride, oh yeah, those first hills feel really easy and you'll be smashing 350 watts or whatever it is up there, and then you're surprised when you're coming home in a basket, you know, later on, hardly able to do 150 watts on the way home because you've overdone it. Well, a good athlete will identify, and an experienced athlete can identify from experience and also how they feel, how much they need to drink, you know, during a session or whatever. But you need to pay attention to your body and learn to read those signs and symptoms and act on them early, rather than leaving till it's too late.
The answer is it surely to just drink more.
That's what it's been pitched as to athletes for quite a long time. I studied sports science in the 1990s, where if you were sort of hanging around without a water bottle in your hand, you were deemed as being, you know, there's something wrong with you. And I guess we've all grown up, if we grew up through that era, you've got this sort of inbuilt paranoia, because dehydration was sold as the cause of most athletes' problems. And I think that was a combination of science and marketing getting together and going crazy. You know, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute was a big proponent of obviously pushing the message that dehydration is bad, because they had a product that could help you if you're dehydrated. But it kind of went unchecked with any reasonable cap on it. And I think, you know, the reality is you can most definitely as an athlete be underhydrated or dehydrated. You can not drink enough, and that can negatively affect your performance. The other side of it, though, is you can drink too much, and we do frequently see athletes overconsume, you know, water, sports drinks, whatever it is, to a detrimental effect. So there is a sweet spot in the middle, and that's not a narrow range. That's a reasonably wide range for most people, but you've got to try and get within that zone, because if you overdrink, obviously we've talked about, if you dehydrate, you get a drop in blood volume, your performance suffers, you feel lousy, and it takes you ages to recover. If you overhydrate, though, you can dilute the electrolyte levels in your blood. And I've done that myself in races. I've drunk so much water when it's been hot, because I was aware of my sweat rate, and I was thinking, I've got to drink loads, that I've diluted my electrolyte levels in my blood. It can cause a condition called hyponatremia, and it ruins a lot of races. It occasionally kills people. So you've got to be mindful of it, and therefore kind of striking that balance is important. And I've mentioned a few times now, like this idea of like listening to your body, drinking to thirst, and that's your primary defense against dehydration and overhydration. The evolution on from that is then, okay, well, in some circumstances, especially if you're going out to do something long, hard, and in the heat, actually then if you wait for thirst to kick in, it can leave you a little bit on the underhydrated side. So sometimes it pays to be more proactive with what you drink, especially if you're someone with a high sweat rate or heavy salt losses. Then you're better off doing, something more proactive. And that's where this kind of interplay comes from between, okay, when do you listen to your body and when do you drink to a plan? But even if you're drinking to a plan, you then need to have this feedback loop where you're listening to your body. So the analogy, I guess, for cycling is really strong with using a power meter to say, right, you might go into an event with a guy you think, I'm going to be able to average 240 watts for this event or this ride or whatever. And I might cap it at 300 and something on the hills but not let it drop lower on the easy parts. But then on the day, you just kind of, you go out that pace for a couple of hours, and then you realize that you're feeling better than you thought, and you can edge it on a bit. And rather than just sit back and hold back and not put out your best performance, you press on. On another day, the story might be the opposite, and you might be really struggling to hold that power early on, and you have to adjust the plan downwards. And so you have to adjust it on the fly. So we really encourage athletes to avoid, to sort of falling outside of those two places, to avoid them dropping into dehydration or overhydration. It's like, you need to know what's a reasonable amount of fluid and electrolyte for you to take in during a given stint, but then you need to just be prepared to go up and down from that based on how you feel. And that's kind of a woolly concept, and at first some people don't like it because they want to be told definitely, when you're riding they think it's like a formula. When you're riding for this amount of hours in this temperature at this output, you drink this amount. But because there's so many other hidden variables involved, physiological variables, wind, humidity, all that kind of stuff, there's no such thing as a hard and fast formula. And it's having that appreciation for a really difficult concept, that actually there's constraints and guardrails that that are probably sensible, but within that there's a lot of adjustment on the fly that's needed to get it right. And so, I mean, that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but is hydration about always drinking more? No, it's not. It's sometimes about drinking more than you thought you might have to. It's sometimes about holding back. It's a judgment call.
To progress what you were talking about there, in terms of starting to look at hydration individually, what is the starting point with that? How would someone who is listening, watching this, take away the advice around having, the margin for error, I guess it is. It's kind of like, you've got the ceiling around what you would drink as a minimum, and I guess the maximum and the minimum. And how would someone go about starting to figure this out?
Yeah, there's a few different routes you can take. I think if you're scientifically minded and sort of into doing a bit of home testing, it's a really interesting exercise to measure your own sweat rate, and it's very easy to do because you weigh yourself before and after a training session. You work out the difference between those numbers, taking into consideration whatever you've drunk in the meantime. And for every kilo that you lose in body weight, that's about a litre of fluid that you've sweated out. And obviously if you control it and you do a session for say an hour or an hour and a half, it's very easy to work out what that relates to in terms of a sweat rate per hour. And whilst your sweat rate will always change based on the conditions and the intensity you're working at, you can manipulate those variables. So you can do that on a cold day working easy versus a hot day working hard, and start to build up a picture of what your individual sweat rate is like in different conditions. There's a blog on our website on precisionhydration.com where if you go to the blog pages and search for how to measure my sweat rate, it talks you through it, and there's a free downloadable spreadsheet, so then you can just bash all your numbers into that. And it also gives you a bit of guidance on, okay, what is a low sweat rate, what's a moderate sweat rate, what's high. And a lot of people, that's a good exercise to go through to calibrate your thinking on how big a sweater you are. But then the quick extrapolation that a lot of people make is like, well, if I'm sweating 1.5 litres an hour, does that mean I've got to drink 1.5 litres an hour? And the answer is never. You don't have to replace 100% of what you're losing, no. But it gives you an idea of, okay, well, if I'm losing about that much, if I put in, let's say, 750 mils an hour over a 3-hour ride, then you can start to experiment. How do I feel based on that versus a little bit less or a little bit more? And sort of that's a useful exercise to start to get your head around what your numbers might look like. We've also got a free online sweat test on the website, which gives you an idea of how much sodium you might require, based on your symptoms, based on your history, without doing a sweat test. and that can be a useful exercise. And then the biggest way you can really start to get to grips with this, I think, is when you ride. Most people are training a combination of indoors and outdoors. When you ride in different conditions, note down in your training diary, your training notes, like how much you drank, what of, and how you felt. And just going through that mental process of repeatedly logging that and seeing how you feel, how you recover after those sessions, you really start to dial those numbers in. If people want to know roughly where to start, and this is always a difficult one, but in terms of numbers, I always think a really low amount of fluid for someone to drink when they're on the bike and we're talking about here, clearly, if you're going out for like an hour and a half or more. Below that, you can get away with drinking whatever you feel like, very little in many cases. But if you're going out for, hour and a half, 2 hours plus, anything less than sort of like 300 or 400 milliliters an hour is quite a low amount of fluid. And that can be possible. That can be, that can work for some people. And certainly in cool or cold conditions, that might genuinely be all that you need. You really might not need much at all. If you go right to the other end and say, what does a big sweater need when they're working hard in hot conditions? We see a few riders that drink a little bit over a litre an hour, but not too many that drink significantly more than that, which then puts you in that zone of, okay, somewhere between sort of 500, 750 mils an hour is often a good number for people to start to experiment with when you're working reasonably hard and performance is the goal. And that's a big range, and so that's not going to give you an exact starting point. But if you think about your physical characteristics, the environment you're riding in, and how hard you're working, the hotter it is, the longer you're going for, and the harder you're riding, the more north you're going to be on those numbers, heading up towards a litre. The cooler it is, the easier you're working, or the shorter you're riding, the more it's down the way. And I think just appreciating that there's this like organized trial and error process to go through to zone those numbers in is a really important thing for people to think about.
Is there a good time to be drinking other fluids? What other fluids might you be drinking? Is it just water, just electrolytes? Do you ever have carbohydrates at all? Why don't you take us through that, please, Andy?
Yes, it's a really good question, because there are two elements to the hydration equation. It's obviously how much do you drink, and then what's in that drink. And I think what's in that drink depends on what your aim is from drinking it, if that makes sense. So some of the time, if you're riding relatively short, if conditions are not oppressive, and you're just looking to quench your thirst and not get too dehydrated, then drinking water is absolutely fine. If I'm sat on my indoor trainer for 30 minutes, 40 minutes on a morning, just doing an easy session before I nip to work, then I'll just have a bottle of water on there. It's just like sip away and keep yourself topped up. When you're worried that dehydration is either going to affect that session, if it's a long enough or hard enough session, or it's going to affect your recovery from that session, because you are going to do a lot of sweating. So, for example, if I'm on the watt bike doing 90 minutes of hard intervals, then I'm going to probably think about starting to add a significant amount of electrolytes to my bottle at that point. And that's where the sort of low calorie effervescent tabs or a drink mix with plenty of electrolytes in is useful, because what that does is that is replacing kind of in real time a bit more of what you're losing in your sweat. The electrolytes pull more fluid into your bloodstream, hold it there, and it means you don't dig as much of a hole for afterwards. So in that example, although I could probably get through a 90-minute session on a couple of bottles of water, I'm going to feel a lot better afterwards and recover a lot faster if I've got electrolytes in there. And those kind of drinks are called hypotonic because they have a lower tonicity. They're a thinner drink. They're less thick than your blood, so they absorb really quickly and they hydrate really well. And coincidentally, well, not coincidentally, but to expand on that, they're the best sort of drinks when pure hydration is the issue. So when you were talking about the Mojave Desert bit and that sort of thing, when you've got to drink really large volumes of fluid, you want a low to negligible carbohydrate content really, and a high electrolyte content, because the primary role of those fluids is to replace what you're sweating out. Where you might add carbohydrates to a drink is when you're going for a high enough intensity, but for just about a long enough time that you're going to deplete your glycogen stores, and energy delivery is really important. So the classic use for a sort of standard isotonic sports drink, so a sports drink that's got 6% carbohydrate in it, is when you're doing a really punchy, hour, 90-minute, 2-hour session, when the sort of, you're going to sweat a bit, you're going to lose some electrolytes, but what you're also going to do is rip through a lot of energy. And having carbohydrates in your bottle becomes really beneficial then, because that's a really fast way to get them in the system. A liquid carbohydrate is absorbed really rapidly. It goes into your stomach, into the gut, into the bloodstream, delivers a spike in blood sugar, which puts the energy out to your working muscles. And that's really, really handy for those durations. Where people sometimes then fall foul of using carbohydrate drinks a lot is when sessions get really long or really hot or really hard, because those carb drinks aren't as efficient at hydrating you. If, to take your example again, in the desert, you're drinking well north of 1 litre of an hour, that's a load of carbohydrate coming in a really sugary, syrupy sort of format. And after a while, it can make you quite bloated and quite sick. So that's when we sort of start to say, okay, when it's longer and hotter, having less carbs in your bottle and more gels or bars or real foods, whatever you're eating, to try and top that up makes a lot of sense, because as you escalate that amount of fluid, you don't want to just keep adding more carbs the whole time. So it's a case of choosing, it's choosing the right tool for the job, basically. And all those different sports drinks, or water, they all do different things. You wouldn't just drink water if you were doing a 2-hour flat out, time trial effort, because you would probably deplete in energy. At the same time, you're not going to smash a bottle of carbohydrate drink when you're just doing 30 minutes easy spinning on the turbo, because you don't need it. So it's a case of using the right tool at the right time.
Again, you touched on a great point. It's definitely individual, but with some of my ultra riders, I always talk about, if you're going to have that, the carbohydrate drink, it's more towards the end of the day. It's, getting through when you've eaten as much food as you possibly can, and you don't want any more solid food in your stomach, because you've been eating and riding a bike for many hours, and that does help. But yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've always admired and love about what you guys at Precision Hydration do is your product range. And so take us through that, because I still believe you're probably the only company, I believe, that do what you do.
Yeah, we started out doing electrolyte drinks in different strengths, whereas most people do them in different flavors or whatever. We always thought what makes most sense is, after my experience realizing that I need really high amounts of sodium in my drinks, was the average sports drink has about 400 to 500 milligrams of sodium per litre. So we have a drink which is about 500 milligrams in an effervescent tablet form. We have one which is double that strength at 1,000 milligrams, and we have one which is triple the strength at 1,500. And that's always been the backbone of what we do, is trying to fit the right strength drink to the right individual. And that's based on the physiology of that individual, how much they sweat, how much sodium they lose, and also the type of event that they're doing. And so that was what we launched with, over 10 years ago, and that still is the key component of what we do, is those, and they come in an effervescent tablet form, very, very low calorie, almost negligible calories, but purely hydration salts. We added on, after a while, a different variant to those drinks. So like a packet of powder, which is also in 500,000, 1,500 strengths in terms of the sodium composition, but it has a little bit of carbohydrate with it. And we did that for two reasons. One was because we wanted to make an all natural formulation using some sugars to sweeten it. And also because when you pair lots of sodium with a little bit of glucose, you get an enhanced absorption of fluids through the gut. And whilst sometimes people use the effervescent tablets along with gels and other sorts of things which put a little bit of glucose in your system, if you're just drinking on an empty stomach, then these powder products can be a lot more potent when it comes to rehydration. They also work really well to contribute to your overall energy intake without bunging your stomach up with too many carbs. So if you are doing a really ultra event, like you were just saying, there's only so much solid food you can eat, and you do want to get a little bit of extra drip of carbohydrate from your drink, so they're good for that. And then we've also got a product called sweat salts, which are an electrolyte capsule which you can swallow down, which again for ultra events are fantastic, because sometimes you're out you're out in the middle of nowhere, all you can pick up is a bottle of water, and you just want something quick and easy to take. You can just wash down an electrolyte capsule with your water that you're picking up from either a feed station or a bottle that you get handed. You know, we work with a couple of the pro cycling teams in the peloton, and because of the ad hoc nature that those guys get given bottles when they're in a race, those of them that need extra electrolytes will take the standard drink bottle that the team gives out, which is like a mid-strength one, and they'll take these electrolyte capsules with it to up the amount if they need more. So that's really the core of the range. And then very recently, in the last sort of 6 months or so, we've also brought out a core range of fueling products to complement them. So energy gels, we've got energy chews coming, and a carbohydrate electrolyte drink that is, as I was describing earlier, is kind of used for those, ideally used for those shorter, punchier efforts when you need a bit of carbs, some sodium, and some fluid all in one bottle.
And I guess you're going to change the name now, aren't you? Your name from Precision Hydration.
Yeah, it's a good question. We brought out the Precision Fuel range alongside Precision Hydration. So it is a case for us of, you know, it doesn't mean we're straying too far from our roots, but I think it's a bit of a mouthful, but I suppose our next iteration is like precision fuel and hydration, because it's all encompassing. But what that'll morph into, I'm not sure. But what we feel really happy about now is that a lot of our conversations with athletes in the past have revolved around hydration, and then there's always the question that follows, like, well, what do I eat with this stuff? It's like, well, we've got some ideas on how to build your fueling strategy alongside your hydration. So we tried to construct a range which is kind of modular, so you can use, like, our gels have 30 grams of carbohydrate in, our chews do, our drink mix has 30 grams of carbs in a bottle. So as you know, most carbohydrate recommendations are based on multiples of 30, 60, 90, even sometimes 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour. So you can kind of, you know, modular use these along with electrolytes to build the total picture of what you need. And that's a really exciting new chapter for what we're getting into now.
As we wrap up, where can people find more information on anything, you know, on you guys?
The best place is definitely precisionhydration.com. If you hit the website, we've got lots of information on there. We've got the online sweat tests, which you can do. We've now also, on our product pages, when you go to the fueling products, we've got something called the quick carb calculator that allows you to work out how many carbs you'll need per hour. In our blog pages, there's tons of information, and the keyword search works really well on there. So if you want to know, for instance, more about hypernatremia that we talked about before, you just start typing that in. They'll pull up 4 or 5 articles to read. The how to measure your sweat rate blog is in there, and there's loads of other stuff. Another really popular article with some people is all about cramp. That's one of our headline articles. I think it is probably one of the most read articles on the site, because if you are, I mean, I used to suffer with cramp, and if you do suffer with cramp, it's one of those things where it dominates every waking moment of your thoughts before a race, because all you're thinking is today going to be one of those terrible days when I cramp. So that's a decent resource if you've got anyone who's listening who's suffered with that. And yeah, just cruise around on there. The other thing you can do is you can always email us on hello@precisionhydration.com if you've got a very specific question that we can't help you with. And you can even book a free video call to chat to the team as well. That's all available on the website.